Thank you, Rafika, and good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome. It is indeed good to see you here, and as some of you know, this is the precursor to our main event, which begins tomorrow. The precursor part is deliberate because all we're trying to do is to see how best we can have broader technical discussions. Why are we doing this? Our strategy is fairly straightforward. We have three key pillars: accountability, learning, and building an evaluation culture. This session will, of course, focus on the last two parts, which is learning and building an evaluation culture. What we've been trying to do, especially on the third, is to work across different stakeholders in seeing how best we can be building the evaluation culture. So in addition to working with parliamentarians, and I see a couple here, welcome, thank you so much for joining us. The idea is to not just work with parliamentarians who are, of course, looking at the demand side of evaluation, because obviously when they are in the House, they are demanding from their government results. And evaluation there, of course, plays a critical part in there. So we work with parliamentarians, and we have a nice network of parliamentarians across the board. We also have a separate group called EPRADI, which is the agencies, the regional development agencies, and we're trying to see how best we can work together in terms of harmonizing many of the practices and principles of evaluation, so to get all of them together. But today we are looking at an instrument, the instrument of impact evaluation. It's interesting because the moment you start talking of impact evaluation, many of our donor partners and our board and others get really excited. The word impact somehow means different things to different people, and everybody thinks impact evaluation is the way to success, and it's the only way we can do it. Interestingly, impact evaluation has a long, long history. Many of you may know the genesis of it. It really started in the 1700s, believe it or not. Early 1710 or so, Dr. McCullen started with something called placebos. And the placebo effect is where the whole story of impact evaluation began. And it carried on certainly until the early 1800s, I think, and 1850. There were lots of studies and lots of placebos and being administered. People were talking of psychological effects and so on. And then somewhere around 1940 is when the whole concept of control trials and control groups and RCT and all of those began. So the history on impact evaluation is a long history. The question is, why with such a long history and such positive stories to tell, besides the psychological effects of the placebo, why is it that impact evaluation has not taken off in the way that one would assume it should? Obviously, many constraints, whether you're talking of the difficulties of creating RCTs beyond certain sectors, such as health and education, or looking across the board at other aspects of it. It's whether they're talking of secluding and securing the control groups so that there are no spillover effects and other things happening. It's a challenge for all of us to see how best we can have good causal impacts, which is what Rafika was talking about, the causal story, with just RCTs or other tools that are available. So within the family of impact evaluation, RCT may be considered the holy grail, but it's not the only way to go about looking at impact evaluation. This, I hope, will be the beginning of a rich discussion going forward. For us at the African Development Bank, impact evaluation is very new. We have started with two impact evaluations, one both in rural water, one in Tanzania and one in Ethiopia. And this was sort of dipping your toes in the water very gently. We've learned, we found some interesting stories, we found some interesting findings and causal impacts. But of course, the key is going to be, how can we now mainstream or scale up the impact evaluation story going forward? Is it worth scaling up? Given the costs, which everybody says are prohibitive, what value added do we have in scaling up impact evaluation? Also, given the fact that it may not be, the lessons may not be transferable very easily, what value added is there in scaling up? So to answer some of these questions, as well as to see how best we can be mainstreaming this going forward, we do have a good technical discussion coming up, and I'm certainly going to be listening intently to our panelists and our professor. So let me turn over to them, and thank you so much again for joining us.
Thank you so much, Rakesh. Indeed, we're here to discuss why are we not using impact evaluation as much as we should. So we have with us today a world-renowned expert on impact evaluation who's going to speak to us about the value of impact evaluations, why do we need it for international development, and why are we not doing more, and what can we do to scale up the use of impact evaluations. Please just give me a couple of minutes to introduce our keynote speaker. Dr. Aguirre comes to us from the Catholic University of America. She earned her PhD in economics from the University of Notre Dame. She's a Fulbright scholar. She served as presidential appointee to the U.S. Advisory Commission on Foreign Diplomacy between 2003 2008. Dr. Aguirre was also a member of the advisory board to the Millennium Development Goals Fund evaluation, which took place between 2012-2013, and was appointed to the UN experts group that assisted with the transition from the Millennium Development Goal Fund to the Sustainable Development Goals Fund in 2014. She is the founder and president of the Foundation for Women's Advancement. Please help me welcome Dr. Aguirre. Thank you so much.
Okay, good morning, and hello to all my old friends. We spent a week working hard. I see several I recognize many faces here. It's nice to see you again. I wanted to thank you for the invitation. And I was planning to give some general remarks and then show you results of some experiments, RCTs in two different shapes to highlight what I'm going to talk about. So, impact evaluation. I think when we think about the importance of impact evaluation, and I would say perhaps to systematize and enter into it more rigor in terms of econometric work, we always are faced with the same thing. We maximize. So we have many needs, we have scarce resources, and how do we go about making the best out of this maximization need? So I would say that RCTs can be a very good way of doing it. And perhaps we need to make a combination of stratification and randomization to systematize the introduction of RCTs in a more, how can I say, consistent way. Number one, so how do we go about broadening the spectrum of, sorry, I'm just getting distracted with, okay, yeah, now I know how to do it. So how do we go about systematizing impact evaluation in a rigorous way. I repeat, my suggestion is we need to randomize. In other words, go throughout the different, first stratify, where do we need, what are the areas, and then randomly every year, and in a sequential way, do some samples, RCTs, to see the impact evaluation. Why? Because we are accountable. We need to be accountable for what we do with our funds, and I think too often we assume things away instead of finding the empirical evidence that in fact works. Not because I think so, because it works. So some of you have seen this graph before, but how do we go about systematizing and why is important? Also to go beyond the strictly typically understood RCTs. Because the world doesn't look like the left side, you know, all these bubbles that include, can you see the presentation yourself here? Is this the only screen? You have it over there. So it is not only bubbles that are separated between institutions, human, social capital, and policy, but we know by now that they all have to work together. And what I like to suggest today, and this is important as to how do we entering in the systematization, which is the topic of today, is that what makes those links work, that machine really go fluid, is the interpersonal relationships, is people, are people. And therefore, when we measure evaluation, we need to include that interpersonal dynamics that exist in every institution, in every operation, and economics is not an exception. So what does that mean? Is that when we do evaluations, we need to be focusing on what are effective channels of relationships, right, that make that economic development sustainable. So as we measure, and that's what I'm going to show you, I thought today, just not to speak theories, just to go to examples, two examples, we need to be measuring what are those channels, because as I mentioned in the very first slide, either we identify those channels, are we sure that work, or no sustainable development would take place in the long term. For that, what I will suggest is, or my methodology suggests, that you need to focus in action, because that's what affects one another. And then focus in the immediate effects. Do I teach you how to read? Do you know how to read? But how does that change your life? Even more important. And I typically look at 4 factors: quality of life, social responsibility, civic responsibility, and social ills. So what we want is agents of change, because if not, it will be same old, same old. And that agent of change has to be generated by the interventions that we implement to obtain sustainable development. So, interaction of processes, and how do we do it? I'm not going to get into the discussion we got back in May or June about a theory of change, so on purpose I'm going to jump all that, completely on purpose. But I want to give you kind of where am I coming from, what the literature has to say about this point of participation, that interrelational dimension of any economic activity or intervention that I was mentioning. What we know today from research is that companionship or social networks are very important and positive, effective channels for outcomes. We also know that the social network theory research, which has been expanded quite a bit, has highlighted the fact that relations are very important to understanding individual economic outcomes. If we really want to understand what works for the and why it works, we need to pay attention to the relationships that exist in any intervention. That also has shift the focus, right, from the individual maximization as we typically understand it in economics, self-utility maximizer, to a relational context where other people's decisions and interactions affect my decision. And that can make a big difference in terms of outcomes. So we need to understand what are those relations, right, that dynamics that exist in whatever we are measuring. And last but not least, friendship. Encourage high levels of participation. Almost, I would say, the danger we have fallen into is that we think we are all machines that maximize self-utility, and we are not. And not only, this is important, why? Because that leads to a richer community life, defined, and this is important to make distinctions, right? Defined as active participation, not as just showing up, but engaging. So because of that, I will suggest that the path for effective evaluations go through RCTs, but RCTs expanded. Same methodology, different measurement, to capture that interpersonal dynamics that affects outcomes. So what I wanted to do now is to show you two experiments. Okay, so I'm going to show you two experiments that I ran. One is a stage field experiment. The other one is a full-fledged RCT. Why the first one, why the second one? The first thing I wanted to suggest, and some of you have heard this back in the summer, well, I don't know if it was summer or winter for you, but in June. And that was that an important component of being effective in RCTs is to test before we go into full implementation. Too often, we realize something did not work 2 million later. And one of my perfect examples that I love is all the money that has been spent in Latin America for computers, and hundreds of millions later, we realize that they don't work, or that they were wrongly implemented, right? We should have checked that before, not 100 million later. And I'm being generous with 100 million, it's actually billions on the billions number. Okay, so one way in which we can do that, I suggest, is using a stage field experiment. So it's taking List's theory of frame experiments, but instead of using it in a computer lab, taking it onto the field and test at a low-cost scale outcomes. Yes, they are intended outcomes. They are not actual outcomes because they are stage experiments. But if we modify certain things, such as role-playing, which the literature suggests that reduces a lot the bias that a stage experiment brings, bringing it to the place where they typically live, make the decisions, which also reduce the artificiality of a stage experiment, and then engaging them in the process, as typically frame experiment does, actually it brings us pretty close to the expected outcome, even though it's intended outcome. So the first example I'm going to give you is the case of a garden, nutrition garden that was implemented in a very highly poverty concentrated area in Alta Verapaz, Guatemala. These were communities where they didn't have electricity, they didn't have water, very high levels of malnutrition and stunted growth. We are talking about in the 50s, 40s, depending on the area, it was extremely high. And it was a very effective intervention. Actually, we evaluated, it was a 4-year intervention But what was interesting in there, the factor was men were marginalized. They were taken out of the picture, the idea being that if they get involved, what they bring is drinking and waste of money, and so they need to marginalize. This had generated a lot of antagonism on the part of the husbands, and so as a way to test for a solution, because that was not a winner, clearly, we ran this stage experiment. So basically, what we did, let me go to the outcomes. What we did was to bring the couples together. We met in what they call it, the church. It's this community center in the different communities in the mountains. And we ran this stageful experiment where what we presented to them was how could it be working as opposed to how it was working, right? So instead of marginalizing the men, we brought them into a team with his wife, engaged the family. We walked them through where instead of each of the trainers working separately, the saving of the entrepreneurial trainer and the agricultural trainer work together with the couple, with the family, with the household to develop the gardens. And one more thing, as you know, in the literature of agriculture on this point is divided. Some of them said that if you sell the produce, that undermines the nutritional dimension of the intervention. Some of them say, no, if you sell the produce, if you allow to sell the produce, what is going to happen is diversification of nutritional foods will come in and it's a better outcome. So we decided to side to the better outcomes, and the reason for that, selling better outcomes, because we saw it. Some of the women were violating the rules, and they were selling the produce, and the outcomes that we found when we did the evaluation were better than the ones who went with the rules. So because of that, we decided to run the experiment assuming that they would be allowed to sell the produce. What I want to show you here, am I going to get out of here? Because I'm sure you can understand, unless the translators tell me they have a problem. Can you hear me here? Yes? Okay. So,
No, they can't.
they cannot?
They cannot.
Okay, so I will do it from here. So what I want to point out for you is some of those numbers. What you have there is the control group. This is, remember, this is only a stage experiment, so I need a control at the beginning, but I don't need a post-control because it's only an hour or 30 minutes of operation, so there's no change in the post. What you have there is the control group, the base, which was where these women and men were before, at the end of the evaluation. The pre is where they were at the beginning of the evaluation. Why do I need this? Because I need to be sure that between when I finish the evaluation and 3 months later when I run the experiment, there had been no change in behavior. So to attribute it completely to my intervention. And then you have the post. What we found is by introducing this participatory methodology where there were no money involved, no monetary incentives, rationale. As you know, the literature has come out to say maybe monetary incentives, after all, were not a good idea, right? Why? Because it biased results. So it's telling us, the literature, that perhaps we have to be looking at other incentives other than monetary, because the moment the money is gone, whoop, there's no more money for the project, nothing happened, right? We have seen that many times. So what we use is only the possibility of now you're part of the solution, really what I call participatory incentives. No money involved. Now you're part of the solution. So what I want to point out to you is some of the behaviors that we found and some spillover effects on behavior that we also found. So at the beginning, husbands were very hostile to the women having business. And now what we see is that the husbands are much more supported, right? more supportive. They are willing to work with a wife, where before they were telling us they were not. We see that women are willing now to have business from 61 to 100%, right? They all want to have business. Before they didn't want to stay with a husband, now they want to stay with their husbands. We see that now the husbands are willing to participate and help in the gardens where before not. But not only that, it becomes a business, a family business. The children also now are involved. I have a business with my wife, 100%, in both sides, 100%. I thought I had problems with the results. When I saw the results, I told my students, go back and double check, because that cannot be, but really these were the outcomes. When looking at really what made the difference, we developed this participatory index. This participatory index, what it does is measure, as you begin the experiment and move towards the end of experiment, how many proactive responses as opposed to passive responses you choose. So in the first stage, what you have is very highly passive responses. That's why the number is so low. And at the other end, in number 4, you have higher numbers because there are more proactive incentives. So what we saw is that at the 4th stage, until the 4th stage, the changes are significant. In other words, the change of behavior makes a big difference. When I went from 5th to 6th, actually the last 3 almost, are not as significant in changes. What this tells me is exactly what I'm looking for, right? I'm looking for a change of behavior attitude from passive, what happens to me, to what can I do to solve the problem, right, and improve. And then once they change the behavior, I want them to remain on that behavior. And that's what the index suggests is happening. What you have here is the probability density function, the community distribution, of the index. And what you see is a big shift, right? And positive becoming the bigger that number, the more proactive the behavior of the different respondents is. So you have this learning curve, a jump, and then they take off, which is what I expect, exponential behavior. Okay, the second experiment I want to show you, this one is a saving scheme. Again, the same area, was Alta Verapaz. In this case, the women, and the 4th year of the intervention, third year of the intervention, the women were encouraged to form informal saving schemes. One more time, husband was out of the picture, and that was created one more time, a lot of antagonism within the household. So what we decided to do was, precisely because of the literature on participation, we thought, wait a minute. If we increase the participation, and again, proactive participation, right? That means both are engaged in the decision process, both are engaged, right, in obtaining savings, or supporting the women's savings in this case, the outcome should be better. And some of the hostility will be eliminated, and in fact, that's what we found. So what we did is we engaged in a year randomized experiment. Let me say that before we did this for a year, we tested with a stage field experiment, as just I showed you before. We found positive outcomes, and so we went full-fledged. So what we did is we divided the women in the households in 5 different groups. The first one only received, or one was controlled, so they had not received any type of treatment. The first group well, all the groups only received training, which was what was happening on the program. The program, they gave training to these women to be part of informal saving groups, and that was all what they got. In the second group, in the third group, what we allowed them was to not only receive the training, but be part of the women's groups, savings, informal groups, which again was what was happening. And then we added two more things. On the fourth group, what we allowed them was to save with their husbands, where before they were not allowed. But they could not save in the informal group, women's group. And on the last one, what we did was to allow them to save with their husband and the informal groups. All of them received the course training. And what you have in front of you are the outcomes. So the participatory index, which is, one more time, wait a minute, sorry. Yeah. The participatory index, which shows the women participating, the capacity to engage. Okay, and then you have women's age, etc., the typical. And what you have at the bottom is how they save with the different groups. Sorry. What I want to show you are the outcomes here, and then we can discuss details. But clearly, the more participatory is the group. So the women that save with the women groups and the husbands, by the end of the year, had 652 quetzales as savings, where, and this, by the way, is per month, where the only training was 56. In fact, it went worse than the control group. The women's group for 482, and the ones who work only with a husband was, well, 411 quetzales. So clearly, the possibility of participation significantly increased outcomes. What you have on the top is a shift. The blue one is the one that saved with husband and informal groups. And when we run the regression, looking at what is the marginal increment, what we find is that the training with women, training plus saving with women increases an additional 356 of 57 quetzales. The husbands is less. It's interesting because the husband is less participatory than a women group, right? That is the additional marginal increase is 327. The way in which I define these dummies, what that is measuring is the marginal increase. And the husband and the wives, the women's group plus husbands plus training, which is the most participatory and all, an additional increase of 151.82. So there is a decreasing scale in the benefit, but still is a positive benefit. So simple, but this is kind of the idea that I want to bring in. Let me say that the cost of introducing this experiment was less than $10,000. Why? First of all, because I don't make money. I don't live out of the impact evaluation. But in addition to that, and this is I want to bring up because it's an important component of what I want to propose in the next 2 days, is participation. We explained to our partners that this was a joint project. They were not giving me a favor, I was not doing them a favor. We were working together to find solutions, and they had to find the solutions. I couldn't. In fact, I got this idea for the experiments from them. Some of them were doing it and doing it correctly. So because of that, there was no money involved. All what they did is they put their part in terms of measuring the incomes every month, reporting it. I put the software and the work on the field to coordinate the collection of the data. In fact, they collected the data. And because of that, the cost was significantly reduced. I think that this is something I want to bring to the table, and we can discuss again. And you are not going to be the first ones to react very strongly at what I'm going to say. But I really believe that this is the path for impact evaluation. We have to take a participatory effect where the agents take responsibility with the results of the outcomes. And that decreases costs immensely. They have to work. Everybody has to put something, bring something to the table, and because of that, the costs are reduced, I repeat, significantly. But it's more important than that. Because they take responsibility, they become proactive. Money ends, and they continue. And this is what I think is sustainable development. It's not always giving money. It's you find the solution. The solution is in all of us. And so what I would like to propose, and for discussion for the rest of the panel, is precisely this, that if we are going to be serious about impact evaluation, given the maximization problem we all face in impact evaluation, the path has to be a participatory path and really true empowering path. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Aguirre, for a really interesting presentation. I just would like to point out Dr. Aguirre's last point, because what we hear about impact evaluations is that they're extremely costly. We've done 2 here at IDEV, and each one costs about $350,000 US. So it's quite high price to pay for a project level evaluation. So what Dr. Aguirre has put on the table is kind of a really interesting approach, a model where you would have a participatory kind of model. And you can see that by using that, by empowering the participants themselves, first of all, you make sure that you lower your cost, and which is one of the key disadvantages, known disadvantages of impact evaluations. And second, you achieve sustainability. So when you pull out your funds or your resources, the benefits still continue. So this is a really interesting message. Thank you so much for sharing that with us, Dr. Aguirre. We still have about 15 minutes before the break, so we could take a few questions from the from colleagues. Any questions? Monsieur Manai.
Good morning. My name is Mohammed Manai. I'm former IDEV staff. So my question is, what about replication? I mean, expanding the program that you have evaluated, and how was it comparable? You know, and what are the other impediments or any controversies around this impact evaluation? Thank you.
Thank you. We'll take 2 more questions. Yes, monsieur.
Bonjour, je suis M. Petit-Lambert, Société gabonaise de l'évaluation des politiques publiques. Pour moi, l'évaluation d'impact qui se passe 1 an après la fin du projet me semble prématurée, notamment sur le continent africain, parce que d'abord, il est difficile de former des groupes témoins, il est difficile de réunir les différentes parties prenantes, et puis il y a des facteurs externes qui interviennent dans le contexte africain est extrêmement difficile. Or, l'exemple qui nous a été montré est un exemple du Guatemala. Je ne sais pas si la culture est la même pour pouvoir mesurer les données et pour pouvoir regrouper les données. Mais l'exemple qui a été donné ici est beaucoup plus importante sur l'analyse des données qui ont été relevées, mais la difficulté me semble toujours de recueillir ces données. Que préconisez-vous donc dans la culture des différents pays africains pour pouvoir former les différents groupes et enfin pour calculer le contrefactuel? Merci.
Merci. Yes, please.
Thank you very much, Maria. My name is Maria Grace Nancha. I work for Tegemeo Institute. It's part of Egerton University in Kenya. My question is about the test before implementation that you talked about, which is really exciting. The fact that it can bring about what to expect in terms of the outcomes at low cost, which is pretty quite an interesting discussion. But then how do you then deal with the aspect of the time element, us all knowing that time is an important resource, and then we get to have challenges to do with changes to do with knowledge, the attitudes and practices. How best do you factor that element into that as you try to see what kind of outcomes you want to get? Thank you.
Yes, okay. Replication, first question. What we did with this particular program is working at the whole country level now. After we did the first evaluation and we ran the garden experiment, that went into implementation. It is being implemented as we speak, so I cannot tell you what the outcomes are full-fledged for the country because it's a 3-year stage and they are in the middle of it right now. In terms of the savings scheme, they did implement that and the outcome has been fantastic. And the reason why I can tell you that part is because in some other sites, they were already on the 2nd year, so when the savings scheme comes at the end and they have been implemented, it has been fantastic. So I know it's hardly to believe because it's very simple. But the good solutions are simple. Who was the one that we asked me replication? Who was the one? Sir. So that's my answer in the terms of replication. On the gardens, the outcome is out there because, as I said, it's being implemented. On the other, I can tell you that has been very, very good. Difícil. I hope I understood you correctly. If I understood right what you told me, how do I deal with the cultural differences? Did you ask me that? Did I understand correctly your question? You talked about the externality, like how do we keep, did I understand correctly? How do I be sure that there are not endogeneities in the outcomes, right? You say that? Okay, so, and then how do I change mentalities? That's another issue. Did I capture correctly your question? Yes? I grew up with a French nanny. And so, but I refused to speak French and now I'm paying for it, I'm sorry. Okay, so to go to your questions, very valuable ones, by the way. Number one, we always work, always, is a condition I put when I do evaluations with a domestic partner. Why? Because as I said, I believe in participation and I'm coming from outside, right? Here we are from the United States. And so for us, the sensitivity issue in terms of culture and understanding fully where they are is very important because precisely of my methodology. I have to fully understand the reality of their lives of those people and the people I'm evaluating and also the cultural sensitivities. Sometimes, though, I go against the cultural sensitivities, and let me tell you a story specifically related to this. I did not bring it up here, but I did also run a program, an experiment on issues of contraception and regulation of fertility. And this was, needless to say, a very sensitive issue in this culture. And so, because of communications and the Tower of Babel, when I was there, they told me, you cannot do this. And I said, what do you mean? We validated it. We already informed you. And they said, well, if you're going to do this, I'm not going, this was the first lady of the country, I will not walk into that evaluation. By the third experiment I ran, she was right there inside. She could not believe the dynamic, what was happening. She never thought it was possible, that there was going to be a respectful negotiation on fertility, and it was. And by the way, the older were the men, the more interesting was the exchange. So I think that you have to be respectful, but also be open that things can be different than you see them. So I work with them on this. In fact, on the surveys, when we collect the data, on the experiments, and fundamentally when we go to do the field trip, where I insist in talking to all the decision makers, I insist in talking with the communities, because this is key. If you don't win them over, and if they don't understand that this is a joint project, you won't obtain the outcomes. So I spent quite a bit of time. I just came back last week from the Holy Land, and I'm working in Palestine in 2 different projects there. And one of them is on farmers, on recuperation of the land, land recovery. And what's very interesting, I walk in there with the Cooperación Española, who I'm working with on this, telling me, you cannot do it. I mean, I just tired hearing, you cannot do it. And so I said, oh yeah, we can. These farmers want to succeed, just like all of us do. And sure enough, by the end, when they understood what the project was and the work that was going to be involved, they immediately said yes. Not only that, they took the time to call the Spanish Corporation in Jerusalem to tell them, we want this and we will do it. So in terms of how do I work with that, that's the solution of how to overcome. You are educating. I mean, you're changing mindsets. So you cannot be surprised that at the beginning you find this passivity. That's precisely what we are battling. So far, seems like the moment they realize that they are part of the solution and that we really mean it, they respond. Not 100% of the time, but most of the time. And in terms of how do I keep the validation of external, because they collect the data, a couple of, depending the scenarios, but first of all, our methodology maps. I do always mapping, precisely because I'm interested in the interpersonal relations, right? The action, how the behaviors of one another affect them. So one way to validate, I map. So I mean, one person can lie, by 3 people or 4 people lying about the same thing in the same manner is a little bit complicated, right? It's almost impossible. So that's how I validate, one way in which I validate. The second thing is we collect the data typically through offline Qualtrics. We provide tablets where they collect the data. So again, it's more difficult to start manipulating things once you enter them, right? They're done. So that's the second thing we do. And if we do it on writing, there's always somebody in charge, which is a little bit removed in the areas. Almost every project has some type of coordinator. And so that's the person or the in charge of the group, the leader. We find somebody who will be in charge of being sure those things are as objective as possible. So that's how I deal with it. But I do think that the externality does not take away partnership. And that's a very important part of the process. Last but not least, knowledge attitudes. We do quite a bit of research and work with locals before we go into a country, while we are in the country. I have the luxury of having a very international program. I have to say Africa is extremely well represented in my program, more than Latin America. This is my problem. I need more Latinos. I have some, but I need more. And then Europeans, we got quite a few. So the probabilities of me being able to get close to the culture is pretty high. And if they are not from that country, they will know about that country pretty well. And then I have domestic partners that I work with. So when I develop the measurements of behavior, I have very much in mind the reality of that given culture, and that's what I measure. I don't know if I answered the question. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Eguere. We can take a couple more questions. Monsieur?
Thank you very much for the presentation, Doc. My name is Pindai Stole from Zimbabwe, representing an organization called Center for Development Research in Evaluation. First is my comment that your presentation has reminded me of the value of social inclusion in development, as well as the challenges that go with it. The second comment is that it is when people whose lives are intended to be transformed are involved that we can increase the possibility of sustainability. So that has really confirmed literature, like from Chambers and others. But my next contribution is a question that the earlier speaker from Kenya talked about time as an asset in development, indeed. And then I was looking at when we do baseline surveys for our projects and programs, should we also budget for pre-testing? And is it not also possible that when we do baseline, immediately after getting the results of the baseline, we can then go into the pre-testing before we roll out the project or program? Thanks.
Okay. To answer the question, what I presented here were two experiments that were run after I did an impact evaluation, right? So if my outcomes of the impact evaluation was my baseline, right, for the, where I needed to be sure that when I was running the experiment, nothing else had influence. So yes, definitely we need baseline, pre and post. I don't know if I understood your question. But as I said, there is not much cost in doing that when there is a participation. Because, for example, I don't hire anybody to collect the data. The subjects collect the data. So where is the expenditures? In the tablets, in Qualtrics, which is not sunk cost because you reuse them all the time, right? I mean, you can buy 30 tablets for $1,400. The costs are ridiculous compared to what you can use, right? And then, yes, you have to pay. We pay quite a bit in Catholic U for Qualtrics, but the return on that when you're running 10, 15 experiments every semester is nothing, right? So my point is, again, you can save money, but it's more important. I mean, you can save money, but what is more important is what you said. You are engaging in solutions and changing of attitudes of the participants. And this is, for me, that's the most important thing. So that's how we do it. But we collect definitely baseline and yes.
We can take one last question.
I am Jackson Langat from the same institute like Maria. And you've rightfully pointed out that social network is very key for enhancing the pace of development process. But now in the African context, I'm asking, how did you manage to bring all the actors in development together that you could use some who are implementing to collect for you data, and you could use the various depending on their roles so that you maximize on the amount of data that is coming that can aid on evaluation without necessarily having them to go out of their way to necessitate an additional cost?
Okay, thank you. That's a very good question. So in the case of a savings scheme, we will have to engage all the partners. So in every evaluation, every experiment or evaluation for the case, actually we do the same thing. We engage all the relevant parties, right? So in the case would be the loan officer, the beneficiary, a family member or 2 or 3, depending on what we are evaluating. Like in the agricultural project, we had 4 children for every household, in addition to the husband, the wife, the trainers, etc. So we do this in different ways, depending on the facilities of the people. So in some cases, most of the time we use tablets, and the tablet circulates. And by the way, I still have to happen to me that one is stolen, to give you an idea. Nobody has stolen those tablets. Remarkable. Guatemala is remarkable because they kill you for one. I mean, to give you an idea what happens when you really engage people. That's the point I'm trying to make, right? So the tablet passes around. And it depends on the conditions. What we like to do is when we do the field trip, we try to capture where people have time. So whether it is the day of the group meeting, so they are waiting, whether it is where they are washing clothes in their communities, whether it is, we just find the place where they are preparing the tortillas. In the case of Guatemala, everybody goes to grain the wheat for their breads that they prepare. We just study the reality of those lives, and we try to deploy the instruments to collect the data where we see is best for them. Sometimes we have to do it on writing, or part of the people is on paper and part of the people is on tablets. It depends on the situation, but that's how we do it. We try to really understand the reality of the lives of the people, and then we do it. And if there is capacity, then we do everything on internet. I mean, we deploy the instruments by email, they responded by email, everything is on the internet. So it depends, again, on the group and the capacities. That's how we do it. Did I answer your question? Oh, no? Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Aguirre. Please help me to give a hand for Dr. Aguirre for her great presentation. So this brings us to the end of the first part of this session. We're going to now take a break, about half an hour break, so we should all be back by 10:30. Please come back, where we have a lot more in store for you. We have a great panel discussion on the use of evaluation and why we have not been using it in the AFDB, in UNICEF. And we also have an international expert with us, Dr. Zinda, who will also give us an outside perspective on this issue. So please be back at 10:30 sharp. Thank you so much for being with us. Money, money, money.